You're listening to Reverie, True Crime, your gateway to the darkest corners of human nature, where we expose the hidden truths of human depravity. These harrowing stories serve as a sobering reminder to keep our senses keen and our awareness sharp, for predators lurk in unexpected places, patiently waiting and observing. Join us as we unravel mysteries, explore motives, and seek justice for victims as we bring awareness to these cases. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Reverie True Crime. I'm your host, Paige. On May 21st, 2002, St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter Bill Smith opened his mail to find something that would change everything. An envelope, postmarked from St. Louis. The American flag stamp was affixed upside down, a distress signal. The return address read only, quote, I Thraldom, a bondage website. Inside, typed in red ink beneath a bizarre graphic of flowers and rakes, was a message that made Smith's blood run cold. Quote, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write one about Greenwade. Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. End quote. Attached was a computer-printed map of West Alton, Missouri. A single X marked a spot near the woods. What the sender didn't know was that this map, this one piece of digital evidence, would become the thread that would unravel everything. Within days, it would lead investigators to a quiet suburban home in Ferguson, Missouri, to a man who seemed ordinary on the surface, and to a basement chamber of horrors that would reveal one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history. This is the story of Maury Troy Travis, the videotape killer, the streetwalker strangler, and the women whose lives he stole. Let's get started. To understand this story, we have to start not with Maury Travis, but with the women he targeted. Because for too long, their stories went untold. Their disappearances went unnoticed. Their deaths were ignored by a society that had already turned its back on them. Between July of 2000 and May 2002, the bodies of at least 12 Black women began appearing along roadsides and in wooded areas throughout the St. Louis metropolitan area and across the river in Illinois. They were found in East St. Louis, Washington Park, West Alton, Highland, Mascouda, and Columbia. Many had been reduced to skeletal remains. Some had ligature marks on their wrists and ankles. As former St. Louis Police Department Captain Harry Heger would later recall, quote, by the end of the summer, it was one after another, end quote. But here's the thing that haunts this case. For months, no one connected these deaths. No one was looking for patterns because the victims were sex workers. They were drug addicts. They were Black women working the streets to survive. In the eyes of many, they were disposable. Let's talk about who these women really were. Teresa Lynn Wilson was 36 years old when her body was discovered on May 15, 2001 in East Alton, Illinois. Teresa had a normal childhood. She loved roller skating and going to the movies with her best friend. She got pregnant at 17, dropped out of school, and turned to prostitution to support her daughter Chastity and a growing cocaine addiction. Detective Kenneth Dye of the St. Louis Police Department would later say about Teresa Wilson, quote, it showed that even though she was a sex worker, she did have a life. She had friends and she had family, and she fell into a rut and she couldn't get out. End quote. Sometimes Teresa would ask little Chastity to wait on a bench while she went to tend to a customer in a car. A girlhood friend noticed how thin Teresa had become and offered to help, but Teresa refused. A local man who saw her working the street gave her a job at his bike shop, trying to help her turn her life around, but the addiction was just too strong. She began stealing cash and forging checks. Her daughter was taken away, and then Teresa disappeared into the night. She could be identified by a distinctive upper dental plate. Her family loved her. Despite everything, they loved her. Mary Shields was 61 years old, a grandmother, when her body was found on July 31st, 2000 in East St. Louis. She was the first known victim, though at the time, no one realized what was beginning. Mary had lived a full life before her path crossed with Travis's. She had children, grandchildren who loved her. She deserved to grow old in peace. Alicia Greenwade was 34 years old, a mother of two, and she was trying. She had recently gotten out of jail and was struggling with crack cocaine addiction. She lived with a minister named Mwanguzi, a woman who tried to help vulnerable women on the streets. Alicia Greenwade called her Mom. Minister Mwanguzi would later recall, quote, "She felt trapped, and she knew that what was happening with her was wrong. It was not good for her. She knew all of this. What she didn't know was how to get out of it." End quote. One night, late, when the minister was fast asleep, the telephone woke her up. It was an excited Alicia who wanted Mwanguzi to speak with a man she had met that evening. The minister hesitated at first, but then agreed to talk to the unknown man. She said, quote, "We sort of didn't know what to say to each other, but we kind of made up a little conversation. I told him, I said, 'You've got my girl over there.' And he said, 'Yes.'" End quote. That was the last time Minister Mwanguzi could hear Alicia's voice. Her body was discovered on April 1st, 2001 in Washington Park, Illinois. She had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, evidence of restraints, of bondage, of torture. The man on the phone that night was Maury Travis. Betty James was 46 years old when she was last seen in Venice, Illinois, in the spring of 2001. Her body was discovered about 2 months after Greenwade's, found in St. Louis, Missouri on May 23, 2001. When investigators examined her remains, they found something chilling: a tire impression on her leg. A Goodrich Advantage tire mark pressed into her flesh. The killer was taking them across state lines, adding federal implications to an already horrific case. Later, investigators would identify Betty on one of Travis's videotapes, her final moments captured for his twisted collection. Between May and October 2001, 4 more women were tortured and strangled. Verona Thompson, 36. Yvonne Cruz, 50. Brenda Beasley, 33. Verona Thompson's body was found on June 29, 2001 in West Alton, Missouri, just 16 feet from where Teresa Wilson had been discovered. Yvonne Cruz was found on August 25, 2001 in East St. Louis. Brenda Beasley's body was discovered on October 8, 2001, also in East St. Louis. DNA from Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley would later prove crucial to the investigation. Then there was Cassandra Walker. She was just 19 years old, the youngest victim. Her body was found on March 24, 2001 in Washington Park, Illinois. But Cassandra's story is particularly horrifying because we know with certainty what happened to her. Travis filmed her murder. On the videotape labeled, quote, "Your Wedding Day," investigators found footage of Cassandra chained to a wooden support beam in Travis's basement, her hands and legs restrained behind her. Travis wrapped a belt around her neck. He strangled her while the camera rolled. With Cassandra dead on his basement floor, Travis spoke to the camera, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. This is First Kill, number 1. First Kill was 19 years old. Name, I don't know, and I don't give a fuck. End quote. 19 years old. He didn't even know her name or didn't care. 3 more women were found in early 2002, reduced to skeletal remains, unidentified, nameless. Jane Doe's, forgotten. It would take until 2025, 23 years later, for investigators using advanced DNA genealogy to finally give them back their names: Kelly Johnson, Crystal Lay, and Carol Jean Hemphill. Illinois Department of Transportation workers found Johnson's skeletal remains alongside Interstate 64 near Muscouda on January 30th, 2002, near mile marker 22 on the east side of the Silver Creek overpass. Lay was discovered on March 11th, 2002, along Interstate 70 near Highland, on the eastbound side near mile 23, just west of Illinois Route 143, close to another Silver Creek overpass. Hemphill was found on March 28, 2002, in a creek bed adjacent to Illinois Route 3 in Columbia, wearing a green sports shirt with a large M and the word Mavericks across the front, along with khaki shorts. She had a healed fracture on her forehead from a childhood injury. These women had been deceased so long that even fingerprint and dental information could not identify them. State Police investigator Scott Wobe explained the tragedy. Quote, "The biggest hurdle is first you have to identify a victim. Once you ID a victim, then you can start figuring out who the suspect is." End quote. But there were survivors, too, though their stories are almost as tragic. One woman, 44 years old, was found near death on April 4th, 2001 in East St. Louis. She had been so severely tortured that she suffered permanent brain trauma. She survived but couldn't help with the investigation. She couldn't identify her attacker. She couldn't testify. The damage to her brain was too extensive. Another woman managed to escape from Travis's house, screaming, in 2001. Neighbors called the police, but when officers arrived and asked if she wanted to press charges, she declined. Perhaps she was too afraid. Perhaps she didn't trust the system to protect her. Perhaps she just wanted to forget. She had gotten away, and that was enough. She didn't know how lucky she was. These women were not just statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. They had favorite songs and childhood memories and dreams that got derailed. Riley Franklin, an SIUE graduate student who helped identify 3 Jane Does in 2025, said it simply, quote, "Every person deserves to be identified and remembered," end quote. But in 2001 and 2002, as bodies piled up, the investigations moved slowly. These women worked an area known as the Stroll, a section of North Broadway and the Baden neighborhood of St. Louis. They were what society calls, quote, high-risk victims. They lived on the margins. Many wouldn't be reported missing right away. When they vanished, the world barely noticed. But someone was noticing. Someone was hunting. 1001 Ford Drive, Ferguson, Missouri. A quiet street in a quiet suburb. Tree-lined, neat houses with well-kept lawns. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other, where nothing terrible ever happens. At least, that's what everyone thought. Maury Troy Travis lived in a modest ranch-style home at the end of the block. The house was owned by his mother, Sandra, though she no longer lived there. Neighbors described Maury as pleasant and helpful even. He regularly washed his black 2000 Mitsubishi Eclipse in the driveway. He cleaned his gutters. He mowed his lawn. One neighbor told reporters that Maury, quote, wouldn't hurt a fly. Reverend Linda Harrison shared a common wall with Travis's home. She described him as causing, quote, not the tiniest of problems. Once, when he surprised her in the shared basement while she was doing laundry, she said, quote, he startled me, and he was so apologetic. He said, Miss Harrison, I'm so sorry. After that, each time Travis came down into the basement, he would break into a hum or a song to let her know that he was coming. Her son, Zabray Harrison, often drank a couple of beers with Travis in front of their homes. Zabray recalled, quote, I don't have a bad thing to say about him. I guess you never know what happens behind closed doors, end quote. Maury Troy Travis, 36 years old at the time of his arrest, worked as a waiter. First at the Mayfair Hotel in downtown St. Louis, later at a restaurant called Holy Mackerel. Co-workers remember him as friendly, even as an advocate against drugs. He would talk about auto mechanics with them during breaks. He seemed like a regular guy trying to make a living. But who was Maury Travis really? Where did this monster come from? Maury Troy Travis was born on October 25, 1965, to Sandra A. and Michael V. Travis. The family started out in the Carr Square public housing complex in St. Louis, one of the city's rougher areas. But when Maury was 10 years old in 1975, the family moved to that ranch house on Ford Drive in Ferguson, seeking a better life for their son. At Ferguson Junior High School and later McClure High School, Maury, sometimes called by the nickname Toby, kept a low profile. He wasn't a particularly good student, but he wasn't a troublemaker either. Teachers barely remember him. He was quiet, withdrawn, unremarkable. Neighbors who knew him as a boy described him as shy but helpful. He would cut their grass and show them how to use tools. There's a disturbing absence in Travis's background of the usual warning signs. No documented childhood abuse, no significant trauma, And years later, Travis himself would acknowledge that he was not abused as a child. He would later claim, chillingly, that he was simply, quote, born this way. His parents divorced in 1978 when Maury was 13. His mother, Sandra, remarried but divorced again in 1993. Through it all, Maury remained really fond of his mother. He stayed close to her. After finishing high school, Travis joined the U.S. Army Reserve. Then, seeking something more, he headed south to Atlanta, Georgia, to study business at Morris Brown College. This is where people first noticed a change. Detective Kenneth Dye later explained, quote, he picked up a cocaine habit, flunked out of business college, and returned to St. Louis. And in order to support his cocaine habit, he held up a number of shoe stores. End quote. The descent was swift. In 1989, Travis was tracked down and charged with armed robbery. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison at Farmington Correctional Center, but he served only 5 years and 3 months before being paroled in 1994. He had a couple more brief stints for drug-related charges, but by 2000 he was free, working, and living in his childhood home. And by 2000, women started dying. Travis lived with a girlfriend named Felicia during this period. She would later appear on ABC Primetime and describe Maury as a, quote, good human being who wanted to help her overcome her drug habit and pursue a career in nursing. But something changed. He became threatening. In March of 2001, Felicia moved out. After that, the body started showing up with increased frequency. What no one knew, and what no one could have known, was what lay beneath that ordinary house, down a flight of stairs, behind a locked door, in a basement chamber that had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. By spring of 2002, law enforcement was finally starting to connect the dots. Federal, state, and local agencies formed a task force. The FBI joined the investigation. Male DNA found on the bodies of Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, but yielded no matches. The killer had no prior record in the database. The investigation was going nowhere. And then came the article. Bill Smith, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, had been covering the murders. He believed that humanizing the victims might increase public interest, might shake loose some tips or leads. On May 19, 2002, Smith published a profile on Teresa Wilson, the woman with the dental plate, the mother who lost her daughter, the girl who once loved roller skating. The article worked, but not in the way anyone expected. 5 days later, on May 21st, Bill Smith received that letter, the one with the upside-down flag, the return address from a bondage website, and the map with the X. The map indicated a location in West Alton, Missouri, not far from where the other victims had been discovered. Investigators followed it and found exactly what the letter promised: skeletal remains. But the real breakthrough was the map itself. FBI agents John and Melanie Jimenez recognized something crucial. The map was a printout from Expedia.com, a travel website that provided custom directions and maps. Here's what the killer didn't know. Every time someone accessed a map on Expedia.com, the site recorded the user's IP address. The FBI served a subpoena to Expedia. They asked for records of everyone who had accessed that specific map of West Alton between May 18th, when Smith's article was published, and May 21st, the postmark date on the letter. The result was stunning. Only one person had downloaded that exact map during that window. One person, one IP address. 65.227.106.78. But an IP address alone was not enough. The FBI had to trace it back through layers of internet infrastructure. They served another subpoena, this time to WorldCom, a telecommunications company that assigned temporary IP addresses to dial-up internet users. Remember, this was 2002, before broadband was common, before wireless internet was everywhere. People still dialed up, and every time they connected, they were assigned a different IP address. It took painstaking work, cross-referencing thousands of connection logs, but eventually they found it. That IP address on that specific date and time belonged to a single user, MSN/Maury Travis. Maury Troy Travis, 1001 Ford Drive, Ferguson, Missouri. On June 4th, 2002, surveillance began. The task force watched Travis's house around the clock. They watched which areas he frequented, areas known for prostitution and drug trafficking. They waited for the right moment. They even went through his trash. Captain Heger later explained the operation, quote, "They stopped the trash man about a block or so over and said, 'Hey, we want to ride with you and pick up trash. We want to get trash from this one house,' end quote. Quote, "They stopped the trash man about a block or so over and said, 'Hey, we want to ride with you and pick up trash. We want to get trash from this one house,' end quote. In Travis's garbage, investigators found a spoon. DNA testing revealed traces from two victims, Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley. They had him. On the morning of Friday, June 7th, 2002 at 7 in the morning, Detective Sergeant Tim Sachs of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, accompanied by FBI agents and other law enforcement officers, knocked on the door at 1001 Ford Drive, Ferguson, Missouri. Maury Travis answered in his boxer shorts. A woman was with him. According to Detective Sachs, Travis was not happy about the early morning visit. Quote, "He was mad," Sachs recalled. "The first thing out of his mouth was, 'It's 7 o'clock in the morning.' But then one of the officers said something that made Travis go quiet. Quote, 'You know why we're here.'" Maury hung his head. What investigators found inside that home that morning would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The house itself was immaculate, not a speck of dust anywhere. Travis was meticulous, obsessively clean. As Detective Dye described it, quote, "When they entered, they found a neat and tidy home without a speck of dust," end quote. While some investigators pulled Travis aside for questioning in his living room, where he sat petting his friendly calico cat, others began searching the house. They made their way down to the basement. The first room they encountered was a typical TV room, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf lined with VHS tapes, home videos, children's animated films. Nothing unusual. But further down the hall, investigators discovered a locked door. Detective Dye described what happened next. Quote, "When they opened the door, the overpowering aroma of the blood and bodily fluids quickly overcame the investigators. Travis had tried to use room deodorant down there and everything, but the smell was too strong." End quote. FBI agent John Jimenez described the room as painted an unusual blue with dark carpeting and a mattress on the floor. This was no ordinary basement room. This was a torture chamber. The walls bore stains that investigators immediately recognized. Blood spatters. Investigators found bondage equipment, restraints, handcuffs, and leg shackles, a stun gun, newspaper clippings of the murders. Travis had been following his own press coverage, and most damning of all, videotapes. Computer forensic experts examined Travis's computer and found draft copies of the letter he had sent to Bill Smith. They found his searches, his downloads, and his digital footprint of death. But it was the videotapes that revealed the true horror of what had happened in that basement. St. Louis Police Chief Joe Makwa would later say the tapes were so disturbing that he ordered mandatory psychological counseling for any officer who watched them. The tapes showed Travis's crimes in chilling detail, and they revealed something even more disturbing about his psychology. He didn't just torture and kill these women, he filmed it. He performed for the camera. In pieces released to ABC News primetime, the tapes showed Travis tormenting the women verbally, taunting them about their fate, and criticizing them about abandoning their children for drugs. One tape was labeled "Your Wedding Day," a grotesque mockery. The video showed him first giving the women crack cocaine to smoke, then having what appeared to be consensual sex. But then, Travis would start asking them to engage in bizarre rituals. He'd have them dance in white clothes. He'd make them wear sunglasses with the lenses blackened so they could not see. Then he would take them captive, binding them with ropes and handcuffs, covering their eyes with duct tape. Sometimes in the bedroom, sometimes dragging them downstairs to the basement, shackling them to a wooden post. One exchange captured on video is particularly haunting. Travis says, quote, "You want to say something to your kids?" The victim says, "I'm sorry." Travis says, "Who's raising your kids?" The victim says, "Me, my mom, and dad." Travis replied, "You ain't raising shit, bitch. You over here on your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm keeping you about a week." He forced one woman to say, quote, "You are the master. It pleases me to serve you." When he didn't like the way she said it, he yelled, "Say it clearer." Or if she stopped, he would say, "Why are you stopping?" When another victim tried to remove the duct tape covering her eyes and knocked his camera out of focus, he told her, quote, "You don't need to see shit. Lay down on your back," end quote. The tapes showed him forcing women to state their names on camera, to say final words to people they loved, knowing they would never see them again. He berated them, calling them bad mothers, telling them they were worthless, that no one would miss them. Psychological criminologist Dr. Brianna Fox later analyzed his methods. Quote, Maury Travis had a rather ritualistic way that he would kill his victims. He would tell them they were going to die, make them confess for their sins, or make them say that they were happy to be his servant. End quote. And then the murders. Strangulation with ligatures, belts, and ropes. On camera, he choked one woman to death with his belt while filming. The tapes documented everything: the torture, the pleading, the death. Detective Sergeant Tim Sachs, who interrogated Travis that afternoon, would never forget the look on his face when asked about the victims. Sachs told him, quote, "We need you to help us. We need closure for the families of the victims." End quote. He remembered the sneer that crept across Travis's face. Sachs said, quote, "To him, these women were less than human." End quote. During nearly 8 hours of interrogation, Travis dropped his head several times as the full weight of the evidence was presented. He wouldn't confess, but he wouldn't deny it either. At one point, he offered to lead investigators to another body in East St. Louis. They drove toward the Poplar Street Bridge on Interstate 64, but then Travis changed his mind. He said, quote, "Take me back to jail." End quote. The only thing that seemed to bother Travis was learning how he had been caught. When investigators explained that the Expedia map had led them to him, he became irate. His arrogance, his belief in his own cleverness had been his undoing. Investigators also made another disturbing discovery. At the time of his arrest, Travis had recently ordered additional handcuffs and leg shackles. And in his home, they found crude diagrams, plans for expanding the basement torture chamber. Captain Harry Heger described what they discovered, saying, quote, "He was going to build 2 cells in there where he could chain the women. He was planning for the air vents out the basement. And since there would be no bathroom facilities, he made a list of things that he needed, and one was adult diapers, so he could keep these women captive for some time." End quote. He was planning to expand his chamber of horrors, planning more abductions, more torture, more death. The investigation also revealed that Travis had deliberately chosen East St. Louis as his hunting ground. He later admitted it was because the area lacked adequate policing. He knew he could get away with it longer there. It was a calculated decision. A predator finding the weakest part of the herd, the place where society had already given up. Travis even told a girlfriend of a coworker that he knew a serial killer and where the bodies were left. He told her specifically about East St. Louis, where he said his friend's car was found set on fire after being stolen. That region would be the same location where Travis himself dumped his victims. He was taunting people, dropping hints, daring someone to figure it out. Authorities were able to match the tire tracks found at crime scenes to Travis's 2 vehicles, the black 2000 Mitsubishi Eclipse and a 1992 Chevrolet Cavalier. A Goodrich Advantage tire mark was found on Betty James's leg. A Bridgestone Potenza track was located near Alicia Greenwade's body. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. In all, investigators linked Travis to 12 confirmed murders. He claimed 17 in his letter. Some investigators believe the number could be as high as 20 or more. Detective Dye stated bluntly, quote, "There's damn sure more than 20 based on the frequency of the killings," end quote. The basement contained over 1,000 blood samples. At least 6 matched known victims. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, and horrifying. Travis had kept meticulous records of his kills, newspaper clippings, videotapes, and souvenirs from the dead. If he hadn't been caught, how many more would there have been? At least one woman survived, but she suffered such severe brain trauma from the torture that she couldn't help with the investigation. Another woman had managed to escape from Travis's house screaming in 2001, but declined to press charges when police arrived. She had gotten away. Maury Travis was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping in federal court. The murders of Alicia Greenwade and Betty James, whose bodies had been found across state lines, giving federal jurisdiction, but investigators fully intended to charge him with many more murders. The evidence was overwhelming. The tapes alone would ensure conviction. Travis was held at the St. Louis County Jail in Clayton, Missouri, and placed on 24-hour suicide watch. Guards were required to check on him every 15 minutes. But on the evening of Monday, June 10, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, guards missed 2 consecutive checks. That was all the time Maury Travis needed. He tore a bed strip from the bedsheet and threaded it through small holes in an air vent above the toilet in his cell. He fashioned a noose. Then, in what investigators believe was an application of the same meticulous planning that he'd used in his crimes, he put a cloth in his mouth, placed a pillowcase over his head, stood on the toilet, put the loop over his head, and tied his own hands behind his back. Some authorities, including those interviewed by the LA Times, believe that Travis applied to himself the same sadomasochistic techniques that he had used on his victims, restraining himself so he couldn't instinctively try to free himself, maximizing the pain and fear. When guards finally checked on him at approximately 8:30 at night, they found him hanging. He was 36 years old. Travis did leave a suicide note addressed to his mother. In it, he wrote, "I've been sick for a long time, sick in the head, since I was 14. I'm sorry for the pain this caused you and the family. My death seems to be the only way out and a fast end to all the publicity." He gave no information about other victims, no closure for the families, no answers to the questions that would haunt investigators forever. Stephanie Talley, Travis's cousin, maintained that he was innocent, that he had been murdered in his cell. But the evidence overwhelmingly contradicted this. Maury Travis had taken control one last time, denying justice to his victims and their families. Captain Hager summed up the frustration, saying, quote, "A lot of those women may never be recovered," end quote. The case took on additional significance in the legal and law enforcement communities. It was one of the first times a serial killer had been caught through digital forensics, through tracing an IP address and internet activity. The case would be used for training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, teaching future agents about the importance of digital evidence in the Internet age. But for the families, there was no closure. Teresa Wilson's daughter, Chastity, would grow up knowing her mother had been murdered in a basement chamber. Mary Shields' grandchildren would never see her again. Kelly Johnson, Crystal Lay, and Carol Jean Hemphill would remain Jane Does for more than 2 decades before science could give them back their names. In 2014, a woman named Katrina McGaw was watching the A&E show Cold Case Files in her living room in her home at 1001 Ford Drive, Ferguson, Missouri. That is when she learned the horrifying truth about where she was living. The house where Maury Travis had tortured and killed women. The house with the basement chamber. When Katrina confronted her landlord demanding her money back and release from the lease, the landlord refused. The landlord was Sandra Travis, Maury's mother, who still owned the property. Only after the local housing authority intervened did Sandra Travis finally agree to revoke the lease. The house, that ordinary-looking ranch home on the quiet street, stands as a monument to the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. The Maury Travis case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about who society values and who it doesn't, about women whose lives are deemed less important because of how they survive, about the blind spots in our communities where predators can operate for years undetected. Former Mayor Teresa Powell said it plainly, quote, "The families are still hurting and everyone needs closure," end quote. In 2025, thanks to advances in forensic genetic genealogy and the dedicated work of students from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, working with the Illinois State Police, 3 more victims were finally identified. Riley Franklin, one of the graduate students involved, expressed what should be obvious, but too often is not. Quote, "Every person deserves to be identified and remembered," end quote. The case also raises questions about what creates a monster. Travis showed none of the typical warning signs. No documented abuse, no major childhood trauma. Neighbors and family members described him as pleasant, helpful, and close to his mother. His only explanation was that he had been sick in the head since he was 14, that he was born this way. But was he, or did something happen that no one saw, no one documented, or no one wanted to acknowledge? Travis took those answers with him, so we'll never know. What we do know is this. Between 2000 and 2002, Maury Travis preyed on the most vulnerable women in St. Louis. Women struggling with addiction. Women working the streets to survive. Women who, in his words, were, quote, "less than human." But they were not less than human. They were human in all the complicated, messy, heartbreaking ways that all of us are human. They had childhoods and dreams. They had people who loved them, and they had names. Mary Shields, Alicia Greenwade, Teresa Wilson, Betty James, Cassandra Walker, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, Brenda Beasley, Kelly Johnson, Crystal Lay, Carol Jean Hemphill. Say their names. Remember them not just as victims, but as people. That's the least we can do. And for the other victims, the ones Travis claimed but whose bodies have never been found, their families still wait. They still hope. They still grieve. In his suicide note, Travis wrote that his death was a fast end to all the publicity. But he was wrong about that. His crimes continue to be studied, analyzed, and remembered. Not because we want to glorify him, but because we need to understand how someone can hide in plain sight, how evil can wear any ordinary face, how victims can be invisible until it's too late. The Maury Travis case is a reminder that we must see people, all people, especially those society tells us to ignore. Because the moment we stop seeing people as fully human is the moment we become complicit in their destruction. Thank you for listening to this episode. Until next time, friends, please stay safe and take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode. As we close out, let us not forget awareness is our greatest defense. In a world that can be dark and grim, vigilance is our beacon of hope. When it comes to the cases we have explored together that have remained unsolved, if you happen to hold a piece of the puzzle, dare to step forward. As author Lois McMaster Bujold once said, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them." Until we reconvene, my friends, stay vigilant and stay informed.